Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. I have some exciting news about the podcast for you all today. Basically, I'm planning to do some additional episodes on the moon and topics related to the moon in the coming months, in addition to my regular Sect Light, Luminary Out of Sect episodes. Today's episode is with Gray Crawford, and in it we talk about the moon and the elements and the phases. It's an abridged version of his recent NORWAC talk entitled The Moon and the Four Elemental Roots, which I've linked in the show notes. From the moment I saw the name of Gray's lecture, I knew that I wanted to invite him on the podcast. Thankfully, because of the generous support of the Association of Young Astrologers, I was able to attend NORWAC this year digitally on a partial scholarship. I was grateful to be able to watch Gray's lecture among a number of other really informative talks. In addition to this episode, I'm also planning to release something on the progressed lunar phase, the Lot of Fortune, and Hecate in the coming weeks and months, among other episodes. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm currently offering natal and horary consultations in addition to a timing consult that I recently launched. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I really appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Gray. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to his website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Gray Crawford, thank you so much for being with me today. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for inviting me on this series. It's great you've been doing all this moon work.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for, the moment I saw the title of your NORWAC talk, I was like, oh, that's amazing. I want to talk to Gray on my podcast. And thank you for saying yes to doing this kind of like general moon content episode. I'm trying to, as a part of this, do additional moon content episodes, like, secondary progressed lunation cycle. I'm thinking about doing an episode on the Lot of Fortune, different kind of just general moon stuff while we're in this kind of year-long moon series. So yeah, thank you for saying yes.
Yeah, that's great. Secondary progressions are a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great idea for your podcast because I really noticed that doing that NORWAC talk, because in order to do it, I wanted to focus on having client examples for it, instead of having it be just like celebrity people. And so I had never actually done that before, where it's like just specifically about the moon. And I just started emailing people, partially just to make sure I'd say what they're okay with, but I was kind of asking them questions about their moon to also get like the words in their own words, their own language, so I could more even better portray, how they felt about their moon. And yeah, it was just really beautiful for me just to hear people talking about the moon. It's just like if you have that kind of conversation, just focusing in on the moon, it really is interesting what just starts coming out with the lunar material and everything.
Yeah, I really appreciated actually that you focused on people that you knew, and not to get off on a tangent, but we both have the moon in our first whole sign house. And so there is like this element of us both kind of having these lunar qualities that we're embodying. And it felt very lunar for you to kind of convey, kind of like transfer light, almost like convey the reality and the life of another person that we didn't really know. We knew kind of like a pseudonym about them and we saw their chart, but you were kind of the intermediary, the mediatrix, as we can talk about the moon. And so I thought that was actually really cool, rather than just like, here's a famous person's chart who we all know and we all have kind of preconceived notions about.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have my moon conjunct my south node, and so it is a moon that's really connected to its own orbit and coming down across the ecliptic. So I think it was a good use of my moon.
Yeah.
And a good use of my moon in that way. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and so you were at NORWAC. Do you want to just talk generally a little bit about how was NORWAC this year? I was there last year. It was super sad I couldn't go, but I actually got to see your talk. I just want to give a shout out to AYA, the Association of Young Astrologers. I applied for a scholarship and I got a partial scholarship to attend NORWAC, so I was able to go on Sunday and digitally or virtually, what have you, and attend your talk among a number of other great talks as well. But how was it being there in person?
Oh, it was great. And I understand some people can't travel and need to do it either virtually or not. But if you can go in person, yeah, it's great just to be there in person with everybody. And I was particularly liking this year. There's so many really smart, like have things together, like younger astrologers. So, and also I'm getting older and older. I'm realizing I'm getting to be like more like one of the older astrologers, which is something to get used to. I mean, I'm 48 now, but
Still quite young.
yeah. But still, like, it was just interesting, and I just was really enjoying that with like the different generational interactions and things like that. You can only really get that at a conference like that. And so
Yeah.
people that are like my elders were also there, and I was getting to talk to. So it's yeah, really it's really great in that way.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of intergenerational contact in our society in general. So any opportunity for that is always wonderful, but especially when we all, kind of all share this special interest and are invested in each other's work and stuff like that. It's really special.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, great. Can you offer us just a short introduction to yourself, your kind of philosophical perspective on
Mm.
astrology, a bit about your astrological practice, as well as, some of the teachers that you've had, some of the influences?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I know people want to always like a lot of people have very identified things they call themselves. I really just consider myself to be an astrologer.
Mm,
I draw on a bunch of different schools of thought, which I can go into here a little bit. I know when I've had to write these bios recently, I was struggling with what to say, and I threw in some terms like being relational and imaginative, and I do use psychology, a psychological approach, although at the same time I have learned traditional astrology, but I don't really see it as a divide. And for example, like I really like the work of Carl Jung.
mhm,
Carl Jung was reading, ancient texts in Greek. He could read Greek, he could read Latin. That's all part of his depth psychology,
mhm,
orientation. And so, but I do practice specific branches of astrology. So I practice primarily natal astrology. That's my main thing. And I really enjoy doing natal consultations with people.
mm,
I also do and with natal consultations, I do use a pretty wide spectrum of perspectives. I also do horary astrology, like answering questions from people.
oh, cool.
I don't tend to professionally give out elections to people, but I guess I do actually do. I do personally use electional astrology, and it sometimes comes up, and I do astrological magic
Mm,
also. Yeah, I mean, with my age, and also honestly, with my age, I could have become aware, I think, of the traditional revival. It was certainly happening
mhm.
as I was getting into astrology. I got into astrology around my second Jupiter return in my early 20s.
Oh,
And
cool.
I had always been into astrology. I was not somebody that didn't, I was not like a skeptic of astrology or thought it was just ridiculous. It always seemed interesting to me.
Mhm,
And my first really major relationship, my girlfriend in college, she had some interest in astrology too, and we just kind of came across sun sign books and just thought, and it was interesting. She was a Taurus with Sun and Venus in Taurus
mm.
conjunction, and I'm a Pisces with Sun Jupiter Pisces conjunction. So I think that probably
Oh,
helped
interesting.
us relate to the Taurus Pisces characterization. But that was sort of my initial interest, and like Linda Goodman's sun sign astrology. I didn't even
Mhm,
know there was like such a thing as astrology charts, or
mm,
and I got really into, there's this birthday book that used to have it like Barnes and Nobles and border bookstores that you kind of go in it's like a big thick book that's everybody's birthday, and it's the signs are organized by decans, although they also kind of throw in a cusp. But I got really into that book and writing everybody's I knew days in there with like their birthdays and figuring stuff out that way. And so it was actually kind of interesting. I had this sort of decan organizational system in my mind initially, but I didn't really know there was anything about astrology. And then, like I said, it's around my second Jupiter return that I finally met a woman who just like asked me, we were talking about astrology. She's like, well, what's your moon? And I was like, what do you mean? And she just explained, well, you actually have a chart. And again, like for whatever reason, hearing this was just like, this makes total sense to me. I don't really know why. And I was like, it just kind of clicked in my mind. Oh, of course there would actually be, it wouldn't just be your sun sign.
Right.
And then I just got really into learning. And for a while, I was just really learning on my own. And I think because I wasn't a big internet person, I didn't become aware of some of that traditional revival stuff. But then basically around my Saturn return, where I live in Olympia, there was a woman that was teaching, her named Rosie Finn. And she had these really
I've heard that name before.
Oh, really?
Actually. Maybe from Sabrina. Is she an evolutionary?
No, but
okay, maybe I'm thinking of somebody else.
No, you are, because Sabrina used to live in Olympia where I live, and
oh, cool.
She probably took some classes from Rosie at some point, or at least went to. So Rosie would always do these. They're called Plants and Planets, with this really amazing woman named Carol Trozzato, who was a herbalist, and Rosie would get up and do like just talk about all the transits for like the next month, and then Carol would get up and talk about herbs that would kind of support the astrology. And so that was really, and then I started, I actually got a reading from Rosie, and then I sort of slowly started meeting other astrologers. But she was a really interesting astrologer, had a sort of harmonic astrology understanding that I don't really see other people tend to have. It wasn't the same as like David Cochran harmonic astrology, and she's since got into Jyotish, but it wasn't also like the divisional harmonic exactly thing. But yeah, so I was into stuff like around that time too. It would just be like the best books I could get, and I was really into like Dane Rudhyar. And around that time, I found Demetra George's Asteroid Goddesses book in a used bookstore, and that really blew my mind, because I was really into goddesses. I was kind of the person in my 20s as a male that's sort of like wanting to disown myself from the male. I went through one of those phases of like, all these male gods are, so patriarchal, and I just want to be into all these different goddesses. And so I had been into that. And so, and you might have seen those books. There's like, I think it's Jean Shibota. It's like goddesses in every woman and gods in every man, where I had been into those books too. And so I had some archetypal understanding of that stuff. And Demetra's book, Bringing the Asteroids, just kind of blew my mind. And then so I was really into that. And then where this all kind of ends up coming together, I'll get to the end of this, is that a few years later, I started practicing. I finally started giving readings in my like early 30s. And around that time, one of my really good friends here was like really into evolutionary astrology through Jeff Green. His name is Bradley Narragun, and he's actually always at NORWAC doing art stuff, but he's actually a really great evolutionary astrologer. He was constantly talking to me about it. And even though there was other things on the internet I wasn't aware of, and they had this like message board you could kind of get on and learn evolutionary astrology.
Oh, cool.
And I just was like, I'm just going to jump on this and learn it. And it kind of actually gave me a structure. And so I actually went through a little period where I was learning evolutionary astrology through Jeff Green. Interestingly, at the same time that Jason Hawley was, and became friends with him through that. And I got a scholarship to go to an evolutionary conference. And that was my first ever conference. And even at the first dinner, I was sitting, and actually Mark Jones sat down next to me and started talking to me. And then this woman was across from me. I didn't totally know who she was. And then someone said like Demetra, and I realized I was sitting across from Demetra.
Wow.
And at that point she had very recently come out with the Astrology of the Authentic Self.
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen that book and that was my first awareness of like Hellenistic astrology.
Mm.
And even though I was at this evolutionary astrology conference, I jumped on the chance to get a reading from Demetra there. And I'd really say my main lineage and teacher and everything would be Demetra. And that's, if I had to say like, who do I practice? It would definitely be through Demetra because of the asteroid. Before I learned more Hellenistic and traditional techniques, I did use a lot of, I don't use them as much now, but I used to use asteroids a lot as a way of opening up a lot of information about the person.
Yeah.
And Demetra has a very strong Rudyard influence, which I really love that it's still there, even when you can tell it's there if you're into Rudyard.
Mm-hmm.
And her mythic understanding. But then, then I actually started learning Hellenistic astrology and got to go on some retreats with her also.
Oh, amazing.
And it was actually really beautiful, the retreat last year, right at the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction when her book came out. It was a Time Lord technique retreat, and I was there for that, and we, kind of celebrate her book coming out. Interesting, I asked her about this because I was curious. She's a totally Jupiter-Neptune person that every time they come together, she's done something like really significant. And that book to me was like such a Jupiter-Neptune great example. But the last day we got to go around and like kind of tell Demetra, how much she meant to us. So that was really,
oh, that's special.
Really nice. Yeah. So that would be, as far as natally, I definitely do use a lot of the Hellenistic techniques, but I think I kind of work differently from other people in a lot of ways because of how long I just spent learning astrology on my own. And it was a lot more about all the different people I knew.
Yeah.
Which is different from how people learn now.
I wanted to get into this because we were kind of talking earlier off in DMs on Instagram actually about I just started learning. I'm 33 now. I just started learning astrology about a year ago. NORWAC last year was kind of a big inflection point for me in terms of my education. And there are so many, I've like started this podcast like 6 months into kind of being a student, and there are so many resources now. Demetra's books have been foundational for me, but also the astrology podcast, and also just having contact with people like you on on social media and Twitter, and just being able to be like, hey, I have this idea, what do you think? And people will just be like, read this, or read that. And that's been super, I feel like there is a real community that's supporting me in my journey and in my practice. But that's very, a little bit different from your experience from when you were starting to learn.
Yeah, and especially because I hear people talking about like being on MySpace and doing, like Chris Brennan will say that in Austin, and I had no idea there was an astrology thing happening on MySpace. I was like on there when I finally did get on MySpace, it was just like music and living in Olympia with like the music scene here. I had no idea people were, so I really didn't know that there was more of an astrology scene. So yeah, a lot of it really was like, like I'm saying, it really was until like my Saturn return time period that I actually met an actual astrologer. And for like almost like a decade, I had just been really interested in it and just learning it on my own. And my ex-wife who I had children with, she was into astrology too, actually. It wasn't like I knew people that were into astrology, but nobody that was like a professional astrologer who's like giving readings and making money from practicing. I didn't know. I just knew people that were like, some people that were interested in it like me. But I think what's interesting about that is now it's amazing all the book learning and all the theoretical understanding you can get. And I think that's like hugely important. It made a huge difference for me to learn. I had the Chris Brennan's course and learn from Demetra. When I went to do horary, I did the School of Traditional Astrology certification with Deborah Holding. So when I do horary, I actually practice that way with like a quadrant system. I don't use I don't do whole sign horary. But anyway, I think there's something important though about taking your time with it and learning from your own experiencing, knowing different people with the placements, and just the actual reality of what people's lives are like that have these placements,
Yes.
which is not always the
Absolutely.
same as what these book doctrines are telling you this is like supposed to mean. And that's the part where I think stuff will be shifting over time, where yeah, now there's a bunch of people coming in that they're all getting that amazing foundational knowledge, which I think is really important. It definitely makes your practice way better. But then there's also like, yeah, make sure you're talking to people and getting a sense of what their life is actually like,
Yeah.
And I think also it's really important to actually be intuitive and be open to the field and what's going on, interacting with people, and the living symbol. This is like a living, alive symbolism. And if there's a great bright book that Brian Clark wrote called Soul Symbol and Imagination, where he talks about this, like if you're just having these things, to a certain point, yes, there are patterns you memorize and certain things mean certain things. But if you're just very black and white and you're very like, this means this, and if you're not open to what is actually happening, it's not alive. You're not relating to it,
Yeah.
That's the way that when I think of like being kind of a relational astrologer, that's sort of what I mean by that, just trying to really relate to what's going on in the space and what you're seeing. And I'm someone that definitely prepares ahead of time, but I think it's important to then let yourself be open to what comes up.
Yeah,
meeting the person.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, like, I'm really grateful that I've been able to do this podcast and talk to other astrologers and have it be intelligent, well-versed astrologers talking about their own charts, and like me asking questions about that, because it has been really educational and for me in terms of and hopefully for my the listeners and stuff, for how these placements actually show up. And we were speaking before about, we're going to talk about the moon and the elements lecture that you did at NORWAC, but you also did another lecture about detriment, and or what's the term that you used for it?
Oh, inversion. It's
Inversion.
Yeah, when Chris Brennan and Ben Dykes did a podcast on it, at one point Chris just asked Ben to give out some other ways to translate one of the Arabic terms. I believe it was an Arabic term, and he threw out inversion at one point, and even Chris kind of paused and was like, inversion. To me, I like it because it's more dynamic. It has a dynamic sense to me.
Yeah, even like antithesis is can have like I think reflexively negative connotations for me. So in a way that inversion does not. Inversion has more of kind of a spatial element to it.
Yeah, and inversion certainly can be. I mean, people use inversion all the time. That something inverted, and that they're meaning that in a really negative way. And I mean, there's certainly challenges with the placements, but I think it's a lot more dynamic. It's a lot more nuanced. And an analogy I used in that talk, which I got a little bit from Firmicus Maternus, that would relate to what we're about to talk about with the moon and her phases, and like mixing all these elemental considerations together. I think it's when he's talking, if I'm remembering right, he might be talking about Venus in certain houses. I almost want to even say it's like Venus in the 12th house, but I can't remember. There's definitely some like really terrible Maternus delineations happening, and then he just like drops this idea about the idea of astrology being like an artisanal painter, and like you're painting this portrait, and like the fire of the stars are creating these like mixtures of colors. And that's what I think it is you can relate that very directly, I think, to the moon and her phases and mixing together with the elements. Like if you're thinking about the image of the person being like a portrait, or like colors, and there's all these different planetary factors that are all mixing together and blending together. And to just say Venus in Aries is like bad and you're not going to be able to do anything, to me is just not reality, because somebody might have a Venus in Aries that is actually really, really difficult for them. And I have Venus in Aries, and yeah, it does have some difficulty, but it's not like there's nothing you can do with it. And you really actually have to look to me about how is that planet relating to everything else.
Yeah.
there's so many things to look at. Yeah, so that's one thing. Yeah, that idea of like how does it, how do these things kind of blend together and mix together?
Yeah, I love as well just kind of the emphasis on astrology as this highly contextual thing with all of
Hmm.
these mitigating factors and details. And it's kind of like, what does Venus and Aries mean? It's like, well, it depends, It's like
Yeah,
Cameron Allen was saying that to me the other day on Twitter. It's like, about this, well, it depends in astrology, like most things. It's very situation dependent on a lot of other factors and the relationship between all of these different things. And
yeah.
yeah, so I appreciate that. Yeah, so let's get into it. What led you to do your NORWAC lecture, or this NORWAC lecture on the moon, especially as it related to phase and to element?
Yeah, I really think I can give the credit to my wife, Jeannie, because a while ago she asked me like, oh, what's a really good talk on the moon? She really wanted to see a talk about the moon, and was also hoping to hear something about working in mythology of the moon, as well as, and I couldn't actually think of one that I could really think is like really amazing. And not disrespect to somebody that, because I probably just haven't seen your lecture if you're somebody out there that did one. But the one I could like, I do really, there's one that Michael Ophik did, that's like a Hellenistic doctrine of the moon, like workshop, but it's like hours long, and it's I think he does an amazing job synthesizing many aspects of the moon together. And so I was like, it kind of gave me an idea, well, I should do a talk on the moon. And then when I got asked to speak at NORWAC, that was one of the things I was thinking about doing. And I have a tendency that I always want to give a talk that I've never heard somebody do before.
Yeah.
And all the NORWAC talks I've done have been like that. And so I started thinking about, well, the moon and the elements would be really interesting. And then the extra element was just bringing the lunar phase, because just to say the moon by itself, she's always changing. The lunar phase is always changing. It's actually so important, and I don't feel like I tend to hear people always getting into it a lot, like how that changes. The meaning of something will change depending on what phase the moon is in. And so I was like, well, that'll be great. I'll just do the lunar phase with the elements. Then once I actually had to sit down and do it, I was kind of it's like, why did I say that? Because I didn't know how I would actually get through it all. I had to like break down the time to figure out how much time I was going to have for each section. And I realized, well, this is barely going to give me any time to talk about anything, but I think it worked out, and I had to just move pretty quickly through it to fit it in. And I was actually really happy because I did get through all the elements. I had to do fire really fast at the end, but I was afraid that I would like not get through them all, but it worked out. So
yeah, it was a great lecture.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. So can you share with us a little bit about how you view the moon and its role in astrology?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, to me, one of the most, obviously, as you know, it's one of the most important things in astrology. Maybe it's the most important thing in astrology. I think it's great that you're doing this podcast, doing in sect and out of sect.
Thank you.
But to me, like, you always want to look at the moon. The moon's always important. Even if you're a day chart, the moon's really important. And it's you always, the moon's always really in any branch of astrology, whether it's horary or electional or magic or natal astrology, it's the thing that you always have to look at. Like you mentioned earlier, I think that one of the reasons the moon's so important is being that intermediary. And sort of like Hecate in if you're familiar with the Hesiod work, where he's kind of going through all these genealogy of deities, and at one point he just breaks out into this really long, extended honoring of Hecate and how important she is as this intermediary force. And the moon is really like that. I mean, it's the moon, and how this relates to the elements, the four elements being this sort of symbol of these cosmic roots of all existence. And when we're talking about the geocentric perspective we use in astrology and how that relates to the celestial spheres, with Saturn being the highest sphere and it's up closest to the stars and the divine, and the moon being the lowest sphere and that sublunar realm of elements, all mixing together and everything. She's really, governing this, and she's mediating this. There's a really great line of Frank Hughes said it in an older text, but it's like she conceives like a womb, the virtues of all the stars, and she pours them down onto us. She's constantly translating and picking up the meaning. There's all the planets are constantly changing and cycling, right? And all the phases are meaning. There's this constant flux, and she's picking this up and translating it and mediating it and bringing it down to us. If you think about, astrology, a lot of us think about there is sort of an ultimate one, like a one source or ultimate nous or ultimate divine mind. That when that breaks into like two, we're really talking about the sun and the moon. And especially in terms of, we are obviously incarnated in these bodies, yet we're connected to, our souls and spirit and the stars and these higher planes of reality, and these intersections of spirit and matter that are so important that we're working with in astrology. And so she really, she governs how that comes together in our body. I think sometimes when people see the moon and they read the traditional things like the moon's the body, or she's darkness, and that might sound like it's really material and not spiritual, but it's really about the idea we have the entire living cosmos within our body. Within our body, we realize that connection of spirit and matter, and these kind of higher planes of reality that we're not usually in touch with. They do, they come through us sometimes. They might show up in a dream or some extrasensory impression. I feel that's very much her in that role of like this messenger. And she's also I used the term carrier bag, sort of. There's a really great essay by Ursula K. Le Guin called The Carrier Bag of Fiction, that I was kind of getting that, because people always usually say receptacle, and I didn't want to just say the same thing everybody always says, but she is this great receptacle, this carrier bag. She's holding all the memories and feelings and emotions, right, and mediating this. And also especially the way the ebb and flow of life, the ebb and flow of her cycle, this the nonlinear aspect of reality, which reality is really nonlinear. And then there's obviously the way our culture tries to place this linear construct on top of this. So she's very like always connecting us back to that nonlinear aspect. And really you can think about too, like the primal chaos, her orbit and the intersections with the ecliptic, are often imagined as a dragon, like the head of the dragon, the tail of the dragon. There's this, chaotic, serpent, dragon, tectonic underworld, sort of magic and chaos aspect that she's also holding that, at times can overcome or sort of flood our sense of like solar identity in a way. But anyways, there's something very primal there. She's always connecting with us too, but then obviously being the great mother, the great caregiver, the nurse, she takes care of everyone and protects. She's a great protective force too. It certainly comes into play with psychology and psychological defenses and psychological complexes, where like I feel like when you look at all those DSM diagnoses of different psychological, what are often called disorders or different things, there's often usually something operating where there's some people have written about this, like Donald Cowshed with trauma. There's often this sort of protective guardian, sort of daimonic figure. It's often about ultimately protecting something within the self. It's protecting this vulnerable part that's then coming out in this maybe distorted way. But that's very lunar, because she's wanting to protect us and nurture us. And even the monstrous, the things that are, monstrous about us, or which are like, or about the psyche, which are often the etymology of that, it's like demonstrating. They're often demonstrating something important that we have to work through. Yeah, there's just so much. I'll stop because I'll just keep talking about.
Yeah,
you could go on forever.
in the lecture, you talk about the three goddesses that are associated with the moon, and you've already mentioned Hecate, and I have a particular love for Hecate. I'm just kind of don't have a strong relationship with her. I'm a little bit I'm towing my way into that, but she is often associated with the waning moon, which is my natal moon. And is associated with kind of like monstrous elements almost, like she is a kind of force to be reckoned with. Also, I spoke about this on the Gemini Sect Light episode, like freely walks into the underworld with Persephone to kind of just because, she wants to, which I find a very touching element about Hecate. But
and also sort of, moon's also about our senses, and which can be illusionary sometimes, but also, really picking things up. And in that story, she very like, she doesn't actually know what happened, but she's like, she's senses. She's like, I know, like, and she's like, you need to talk to the sun.
She doesn't see it. She kind of like hears it.
Yeah.
So that, there is this kind of like other knowing that's happening. And I also just want to point out, like, what you talked about in relation to the spiritual element of the moon, and the moon's rejoicing in the third. And I think that, in my episode with Cameron Allen, where we talked about like the Rob Hand's comment about Mercury and the lot of fortune and astrologers and their charts, he was really talking about the third house and how important that is as a house of divination. And I really think that speaks to the moon's joy and all the moon does in astrology, as well as the moon's governance of sleep and dreams and these kind of liminal spaces, like kind of that are kind of akin to dream space.
Yeah, and also the third house with ritual and your own sense of ritual and divination and kind of personal relationship there. Yeah, that's great. That's actually, I have my lot of fortune in the third house, and for some reason, I don't know why I hadn't thought about that in the lunar context of it being the house of the joy. That makes me feel a little bit better about that cadence.
Yeah, I was just
cadent place.
I was just reading Demetra's volume 2, and she was talking about the house of the lot of fortune as the house of the moon in the chart, which I think is an interesting idea.
Yeah, I know that Rob Hand. I have that in terms of the what is it? The 11th place for my fortune is Gemini, where I have my moon, so it has that Mercury connection there. But I don't think everybody has that who's an astrologer. I think it's probably more common than you might be surprised at how common it is, but you don't need to have that to be an astrologer. Yeah,
and it's interesting because like there can be, just like in astrology, how things are situation dependent. It's like multiple testimony is also an important thing. And I was reminded of the Pikatrix episode of the astrology podcast where Christopher Warnock is talking about angular moons and astrologers and going to Japan and kind of seeing that come up, angular moons or, dignified moons. And so like, that's another example as well.
Moon
in the first house.
Yeah. And this is a little, I guess, not off topic because we were talking about the moon. In the one time I was learning from Demetra, I think it was actually at the retreat I was at last year, where she said this. We were talking, I think it was it might have been in the context of zodiac releasing. It was definitely in the context of one of the techniques. And she uses a little bit of a different system, which I actually do think is important to consider. That sure, the fortune houses are really important, but also the angular natal houses would be, because you might have fortune in a cadent house. And it's not like, which I do, obviously in the third house, and she does too, apparently, because she was talking about herself. I don't remember her chart offhand where she has a lot of fortune, but she was given an example of, I think it was like she had been doing all this research or stuff, for her, it was like this huge active period, like kind of like a fortune period. It was like really active and so much was going on in her mind and she was having all these realizations. But if somebody was like, oh, what happened? It would be like, well, nothing happened. I was just sitting at my house. And I thought that was a really good example of like a cadent, that idea of like a cadent fortune. And sort of like in this in-between realm. It's not like it's necessarily like this big outer event. It might be more this real active quality in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the metacosmic nature of the cadent houses, and also kind of the internal nature that Demetra emphasizes with the cadent houses. So yeah, that's very interesting. All right, and so to move on a little bit, can you share a bit about the importance of temperament in astrology and how that plays into your lecture?
Yeah, so temperament is definitely a major thing in older forms of astrology, and then seems like it kind of fell to the wayside a bit until the traditional revival came around. One of the main source I've had working with temperament is Doreen Greenbaum has a really good book on temperament that I would recommend, where she puts together a lot of the history of it. And in that book, she talks about how it's from the Latin temperamentum, which basically means a mixture. And so that idea of a mixture makes a lot of sense, because when we're talking about these cosmic roots of all creation being like the elements, and we then talk about them being divided into these qualities of hot and cold, or dry and moist. The temperaments are all like mixtures of these different elemental qualities, and each of the four temperaments is associated with one of the elements, although it's like they're exactly the same thing. But and Doreen Greenbaum just defines it as being sort of a person's nature or inherent disposition, and so she sort of contrasts that with temperament not really being the same as personality, because it's something that's just very innate, and a little bit different from character in that way too. So it doesn't have really, it's something that doesn't have anything to do with external conditioning influences. The idea of it is that it's something very inherent. Like, and she gives the example that she is apparently phlegmatic to at least some degree.
Yeah.
Which
It's just kind of like the nature of water, this kind of internal flowing quality.
Exactly. And although it can be a little stagnant too, slow. But she was like, I might admire this person's sanguine quality, which is very like social. And she could learn those skills. She could learn to be more social and learn these social skills, but it's not that like inherent nature. And so that's sort of what it's picking up. But yeah, so phlegmatic, for example, would be the cold and the moist, which is like water. So those qualities are basically the hot qualities are things that are just active, really externally directed. They're going to like speed things up, increase energy, and that's like fire or choleric or air or sanguine. And that's also seen to be very generative in terms of like life and like bringing things to life, like heat increasing at spring into summer, and like that increase of growth, and then coldness is more like centripetal and inward, and slowing things down, decreasing energy. And then they're the more active qualities, and the other two, the moist and the dry, are a little bit more passive or influenced by those other qualities. And the moist is the more connectivity, absorbing things, open to other influences, but not really clear boundaries. There's like this diffusion and openness. So those are, and there can be more like of an abstract synthesis of different ideas and perspectives that happen. And that is going to be more like the air and water signs. And then the dryness is more like separating things and making things more, can be more analytical in that way, and more particular.
Maybe like more kind of compartmentalized in the way that Earth can be compartmentalized.
Yep, more compartmentalized. And then fire also could be like very like, fire can also be very like black and white. This is the way it is, like my way or the highway. Like I'm, we're doing it this way. And this ends up, we can get into that. This gets into like the whole lunar phase and elements come into this. But then I guess just to briefly mention the temperaments, and then we can talk about the moon more. But so like that choleric quality, which is hot and dry, more like fire, that's the people that are like these strong will forces, and they're like that fiery ambition, and they can be more aggressive and assertive and like taking charge, but like impatient and like really demanding, but they also work really hard. But then they don't really understand, necessarily why they're like pissing people off. They want to be in charge. They like to be on, like to be running things, have high expectations, and then they want to like, put in the work to make it happen.
Push it
and
forward,
then, yeah. And that's, and so it's not exactly the same as necessarily as fire, but it has those same qualities. And then sanguine is the more like, just really social and friendly and good networkers and more forgiving, as opposed to like the cleric, probably wouldn't be as much. And but it can be a little bit more unfocused. So it's got that air quality in that way too. Right. That it's, might not stick with something. I just want to kind of go out and have a good time, but they're, great people to have around, and and also being hot and moist. So it's also one that's very like life affirming in that way. And then, you mentioned the phlegmatic, that's cold and wet. And that's like, really strong emotions and feelings, but really slow and reserved, even though there's lots of feelings, like, it's like that still waters run deep, and they're more contained. And, I'm pretty sanguine and phlegmatic, and I have the phlegmatic. It's that quality of like, you can procrastinate, or something happens, you're like, oh, I'll just got that tomorrow. Like they might not just jump on taking care of something right away. They can also learn to do that, but there might be that slowness in that way. Like I guess compared to sanguine, they have a better ability to like focus in on something and really learn it. And then melancholic, being cold and dry and earth, would be like melancholy. They can get depressed and be pessimistic and have that kind of attitude like nothing's good enough, but that critical eye and that analytical ability, and they're very logical and deliberate, and work hard again, and that kind of thing. So those are like the temperaments. But the way it comes in with the moon, obviously the moon can be in one of these elements. And, like most things in astrology, people have different opinions. Ptolemy talked about the moon being a little bit on the warmer side and moist, whereas other people like Abu Mashar see the moon as being more cold and moist. I think everybody though agrees the moon's moist.
Yeah.
And that watery quality to me really actually makes
a lot of sense.
I feel like I'm a little bit more on Abu Mashar's side there, but I also think that there's something about this where I'm not totally black and white in how I work with this. And one of the things I like about Ptolemy's model is with the lunar phases, there's a little bit more of a flow where the new moon would be more that kind of cold quality. And then once it's getting visible, the moisture is increasing. And then, the heat comes in and starts increasing more as it's waxing towards fullness. So it's going from being very much more open and connective to different ideas to being way more, and not as good boundaries, to way more, generative and focused in on particular things. And then it starts drying out. And then as it's waning and heading through that last quarter, the cold is like increasing a lot. The technique though that Dorian Greenbaum cites that seems like the one that's used a little bit more in temperament, and it's the one that Marsilio Ficino references when he says like the moon is a second sun. She creates 4 seasons every month. It's the one that William Lilly mentioned. Abu Mashar in his great introduction also mentions this, which is that if you just quarter the moon into 4 phases, that first phase would be more like the air quality, and that, or I guess you could say sanguine, or that increasing heat and that moisture. And then the first quarter to the full moon would be more like fire, or the heat's increasing more and it's hot and dry. And then as soon as it's waning, where it's starting, the coldness is coming in, but the dryness is more predominant at first. I think it's more helpful to me thinking about that it's all sort of like a gradation of things, and thinking about the blending and mixing, but then it's turning increasingly cold, and then as the coldness is increasing more and more, as we're in that last quarter to the dark moon, it's also becoming wet, sort of like in the morning, like the dew on the grass after night, right? And that's more watery than at the end.
I think it's important to point out that like you can think about it in a kind of more clear-cut way of like first quarter is hot and moist, second quarter is hot and dry, but there is also another way of thinking about it in a more nuanced fashion. To kind of go into in the lecture.
So I think that you definitely can. And then there's a way I think, to me, because I do like to think about things that are psychological, I think there's a lot of interesting psychological directions you can start taking those ideas and work with it that way. Another quality would be, I guess, the waxing side of the moon, especially in Maternus. It's seen as much more like diurnal, and the waning moon being more nocturnal. And he has some really crazy examples of like over the top, like the waxing moon with Venus, and just these like Venus gone, overly lustful, and sleeping with everybody in a family as well as other people, whoever,
Lord.
So it's sort of like almost like putting and I think the thinking there must be that it's a more diurnals, and it's so hot and waxing in that generative way that it's really amplifying the qualities of Venus, whereas you'll see him sometimes describe the waning Venus not quite having that quality, but whereas the waxing can be more generative or like diurnal or like more building something material focused, the waning can be more spiritualizing or that kind of inner dark, especially someone like you said, you're towards the end of the lunar cycle, so that's definitely a part where it gets way more internal. And there can, you could have a waxing moon that's obviously interested in spiritual matters, but there can be a tendency for that real internal drawing within to be really accentuated by that waning phase there.
Absolutely, which is really interesting, because I was just looking at the natal temperament that I calculated for myself, and I'm actually like slightly, so moistness and dryness are balanced 3 and 3, but hot, I'm like a 5 for hot and like a 2 or 3 for cold, and so I'm like slightly choleric actually, and I have my moon in a fire sign, but it's a balsamic moon, and so there is this kind of interesting interplay that's happening between internality and also the kind of externality of fire.
And you're a Sagittarius moon, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So do you feel like, so the way that's a good example of what we can talk about here. So then when you start thinking about how these things combine, right? So Sagittarius moon, you might think this is just really fire. They're just going to like head off and do whatever they want. They might be really unrestrained and, really enthusiastic and in ways that are good, but also maybe, leaping really far ahead without thinking. You know what I mean? That kind of way with
a bit
like
impulsive,
overly impulsive. Do you feel that how do you feel the waning phase sort of mediates or modulates that quality?
I mean, I definitely think that with the moon waning in my first, I very much resonate with turning inward to find my spiritual center, and like finding God within me, like deep down within, kind of that kind of idea. And so I definitely think there's also a lot going on. I think there is a lot kind of like just at the surface in terms of emotions that are always very present. Like I can, I definitely have a little bit of a tendency to get angry at things and kind of like voice that anger, if someone like cuts me off or something like that, or you see someone kind of doing something. But there's also a lot of joy that's present. There's also a lot of like I could probably cry on command, it's just all right there. But I don't know. I've had throughout my life. And I think this is partially to do with just like my upbringing and situations in my childhood. Very often people have been like, oh, I don't really know, like I can't really read you. And so there is an element of like kind of using that internality, that internal kind of tendency as an element of self-preservation, to not kind of
Oh,
give too much away if I'm feeling unsafe, or it was more operative kind of in my childhood where certain kinds of expressions were not really safe, didn't feel safe. So it's kind of interesting to reflect and see how things have changed over time as
mhm.
well.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting with the childhood aspect and that being like a sort of defense or a lunar protective mechanism that
Hmm.
you develop. But that's what you were describing is what I would kind of wonder is that at the same time, there's probably just a little bit of a self restraint that you just have anyway
Hmm.
with that inward pull. And that would be one way that I would think about the when we're thinking about this elementally and the way these things mix and blend or change, like because the fire moon would if we were going to put fire with the lunar phase model we were just describing, it would be more like the full moon.
Hmm.
And so like a fire moon like waxing to fullness would be like this real extreme
Yeah.
radiation of that. And probably somebody that's we know what they feel because
Hmm.
it's very apparent how they're feeling about things.
Hmm.
Not trouble reading that person, maybe. Not as much as maybe you being more complicated in that way, but it's also like a self restraint. I would see it as in like being able to. I mean, all fire means, like you mentioned, are always going to get angry and upset at times, and just
Hmm.
have be kind of engulfed in flames temporarily.
Yeah.
But typically, yeah, it's I think I mentioned this in that talk, it does go by pretty fast. I feel like with fire moons, it's like the ones I've known at least, it's like it's just gone then. And I feel like the waning fire moons have that quality even a little bit more.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess the contrast would that be if it was like a more like early waxing fire moon, there would also be some tempering there. Like I would see your moon as being pretty tempered by that phase. And then the early waxing would also be, I mean, it would definitely be very impulsive and spontaneous, but because there's that moist quality interacting with that hot dryness, they're going to be more, I think, to me, they would tend to have a tendency to be less like black and white and less like just do it my way and be more
Hmm.
kind of friendly and like that kind of sanguine affable quality and being more open to other people's ideas and but then bringing those gifts of the fire to that at the same time.
Yeah, it's really interesting in terms of, one thing that comes to mind is that you spoke a little bit about the moon's temperament, but I think maybe a good reminder for people is also that planets have temperaments as well.
Yeah,
And kind of we think about, I think, Jupiter partially as like the greater benefic for a number of reasons, but part of it is the hot and moist quality that it has, which is thought of as conducive to life. And
yes, exactly.
Venus is cold and moist, or maybe warm and moist. A way to think
And
about that.
I think Ptolemy says hot and moist, so that's one of the things where there's some, but I'm pretty sure Abu Mashar has a takedown of that
Hmm.
in the
Yeah, it's like how do the sect considerations come in, because Venus is a night planet, and so the night brings an element of coolness as well. I don't know. That's how I've kind of thought about it.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I like the idea of Venus being sort of a I've heard also like a more like a temperate warmness. That
Mhm.
would make sense to me.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. What's the planet that's the most fertile, all about life and growing things? It's Jupiter, and it's given those hot and moist qualities. And then
Mhm.
Saturn is cold and dry, but the excessive coldness, which is sort of what situates it in the malefic category. Although there's obviously good things about Saturn, and same thing with Mars, hot and dry, but it's often said to be excessive dryness,
Mhm.
which is that again that other quality that's seen as being like you'll actually see people say like anti-life, but I don't like I don't want to see people take that the wrong
because the sun is
take that the
also
wrong way. But yeah,
the sun is also hot and dry,
the sun is hot and dry.
that's
Yeah.
part of the reason why Mars is like not as affected under the beams of the sun like a planet like Venus, for example, because their natures are congruent. And so but like we literally cannot have life without without the sun.
Yeah, and so then what you want to do, that's great that you're bringing this up with the planets, because then what you do the same thing, so that the planets have these qualities. You can then think about, okay, now we're putting it in this sign. So like Saturn and Pisces right now, we're taking Saturn's excessively cold and dry, we're putting it in a cold and wet sign. It's like really cold.
Yeah.
It's like, so, and we can see that, so the moistness is coming in, and yeah, Saturn Pisces can be very creative and imaginative, but there can be this tendency to that depression and melancholy, and that sort of downward spiral.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason that you said that my fire moon, which is kind of hot and dry, mixed with the solar phase, the waning solar, the waning lunar phase, which is like a cold and moist, there brings elemental balance. And I think throughout thinking about temperament, what people were trying to do with medical astrology or what have you is bring a kind of balance to the temperaments.
Right. And the other thing to think about is with this too is, which I think we sometimes forget when talking about, because I think people look at the astrology chart, like for example, unless you count my IC, which my Imam Coeli, which I do think is important, I have that in Virgo, but I have no planet, I have nothing in an earth sign unless you start bringing asteroids.
Okay.
Now I could be like, I don't have any earth, but one thing we could think about is like the different phases, but also like we all have it. So we have all these qualities. And so there's another way to even think about, mentioning the astrologer Brian Clark again. He has a really great way of talking about when you lack an element. It's forgetting the exact phrase he talks about, but it's sort of just like this fertile void. It's almost like, well, actually anything can happen there. Like you do actually have, we have all these elements, like all these elements are part of life. And so we might be particularly have these issues we're working out within certain elements or certain of these qualities. I think I might have gone sidetracked from what you originally were bringing up, but
okay.
But going back to what I was gonna, when you're talking about about being tempered by the phase, medically or herbally, you could be doing that in terms of looking at a remediation, or maybe there's even something astrological magic wise. You want to bring balance by bringing something else in that's sort of coming into these different mixtures. But it's not just the moon. So like when I was mentioning Saturn being in Pisces, but we also have the Saturn synodic cycle, and the quality of Saturn is actually going to change depending on what phase of the synodic cycle it's in. And that's the same with Mars, it's the same with Jupiter, it's the same with Mercury. And so there is a way that you can layer all these things together. And the synodic phases and the solar phases, I think, are so important about all the planets. And it's one of the parts where you don't always see people considering that, or they might just be like, well, retrograde's bad, or some people might be like, well, retrograde's more internal, and which I do think is the case, and can but yeah, there's also just like looking at what part of its retrograde phases it in, and what so there's a way you can really apply this to all the planets, and their phases.
Amazing. That's really thought-provoking. A whole nother conversation, probably a whole other class just right there of planetary synodic cycles. Wonderful. I know that we've gone on quite a while, but are there any other examples that you want to give in terms of the relation of element and lunar phase?
I mean, people can definitely get my talk, and I have examples in there. But I was one that's not in my talk. I just did a consultation last night, and see if I can briefly mention. It was really interesting for a number of reasons preparing, I was like, there's some kind of major ancestral thing happening here, and this person has this major ancestral issue and patterns they need to be working with, and it'd be interesting to find out if they work with ancestors or could develop something there. And it turned out she's born in Taiwan but had come to America, but then is living in Japan because she married a guy from Japan, and they have young children. They're like 5 and 2.5, and she is stuck at home in this parenting role and just really frustrated. And she is born like in 87, so has that like Saturn and Uranus and Sag, but she's born right after a Capricorn new moon, so the moon's like maybe 9 degrees in front of the sun, and it's squaring her lunar nodes in Libra and Aries. She wanted to talk to me because she knew she had a nodal return coming up. And so she has her moon at the southern bendings in Capricorn, so it's like the moon's lowest point of its orbit and latitude. But being in Capricorn is also extremely out of bounds in southern declination. So it's a moon that's like lowest possible latitude, squaring the nodes, extremely out of bounds by declination. Capricorn Earth, but barely a new moon, like 9 degrees. And then because she's in 87, her sun is only like, had just separated from Neptune. Her Neptune was like a few degrees away from her sun. And she had Mercury at the beginning of Capricorn, also combust. Like Mercury was like going into Neptune and the sun, and the moon was just pulling away from like all of them. So like this is like this incredibly, and she had been a writer before, but just obviously there's so much imagination. You'd be probably saying that anyway, just seeing, okay, Mercury, Neptune, Sun. But when you bring in this Earth moon, the very beginning phase, which would be so incredibly moist and internal, but like really and out of bounds and at the bendings, and you know, really connected to these unconscious depths. And we then talked about, well, she still is Capricorn though, and we're talking about different things she could maybe do, like even if it's just creating, well, first of all, she needs to carve out some space for herself, but also maybe, you know, I was just wondering if she could even just get like a Substack or something, just create some kind of container to start expressing things, start getting something going. But and it turned out there was also like, and the moon was also basically conjunct her IC. There were other reasons though for the ancestral stuff, and it turned out like this was like this huge pattern of like, you know, the mother of the mother of the mother have all been, you know, and she's finding herself in the same situation. Wow. But anyway, I feel like I don't know if that made sense, but bringing in those extra elements of just the thinking about being this new moon person, and that there is this like news, because like, you know, we can think about that like there's, if we think about news to the divine mind, there's like some new message or, you know, this quality that is there in her chart, but it's also not really visible yet. So she is someone that has a trouble like being seen in the world. And we talked about too, that might be easier for her to find someone to kind of collaborate with or kind of help her start putting herself out there more. But yeah, that's hopefully does that make sense the way I was
absolutely
describing that? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. The lecture was amazing. Do you have any additional thoughts you'd like to share before we just wrap up?
No, that's great. I feel like we covered a lot.
I think we did it. So Gray, where can we find you, and when will this lecture be available for purchase on the website?
So it's available right now on my website, which is graycrawford.net. It's spelled GRAY Crawford.net, and I have a site there where I'm often writing about lunations or other things. I also do have a Patreon if you want to join that. There's a lower level which just gives you some discounts on things, and I also will share videos or some extra content. Like I'll do little YouTube videos that aren't on my YouTube channel that are only people on Patreon get to see. And then I have a $9 level, which is around the first crescent light of each lunar cycle. we have a meeting and get together and just talk about whatever people want to talk about, and often look at people's charts. And that I didn't realize it when I created, but it's turned out to be, I feel like, really helpful for people in that way, because people will get on there and start talking about their charts. So you can hear, it's a good way to learn that way, because you can hear people talking about their charts and what's going on, and we can see it.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And then at a higher level, $20 level, usually a little bit after the full moon, there is another one, which is more of a class that I'm teaching, but it's what it's turned into more recently. My wife, Jeannie, who is a talisman maker and works with the stars often, she recently did a Swalis talisman.
Yeah, she partnered with Sasha.
Yeah, exactly. She's about to release a Denna Balgetti talisman. We have turned that class this year into like a fixed star class, where we talk about the mythology of the stars, as well as magical application, and a little bit too about like natal charts and parans. But it's a little bit more on the side of like mythology, magic, and ritual with the stars.
Yeah, my partner's one of your patrons on Patreon, and she actually got one of those talismans, and we were watching that lecture beforehand, and it was really, really interesting. There's so much about the fixed stars I have no idea about, but it was cool to watch a little bit of that. And I love that you have it organized around the moon cycle. That's super cool.
Yeah. That Swalis and talisman is pretty beautiful.
Yeah, we watched a movie the night that she got it, or the night that she bought it, that was like really super synced. This like really disjointed, like achronological plot structure. She was just like, wow, this is so synced up with the talisman I just got. It was really cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Wonderful, Gray. Thank you again so much for coming on. It was a pleasure talking with you. And I hope we can chat again soon, and I will see you soon.
Great, thank you.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.